welcome to everybody. I'm so glad that you're joining us today for our speaker series. Please put your name in the chat and be sure to switch the blue button on the bottom from hosts and panelists to everyone so that we can all rage together. Jack, we call this our Rage Fridays because oftentimes
Okay.
we are talking about things that, enrage us. And what a wild couple of weeks of rage it has been. Just a constant flow of rage. Thank you to everybody who showed up to our annual day at the Capitol and all the volunteers, staff, board members who pitched in to make it a success. It was wild. The wind was absolutely bananas, but we made it work. So thanks to everybody for helping us manage all the chaos that the weather delivered us last Thursday. And please let us know in the chat if there are any protests or other actions that you are taking, maybe groups that you're involved with, or other ways to combat the Christian nationalist coup that is currently taking place in front of our very eyes every single day. And next week, we hope to push pause on the Rage Friday vibe and push play on the Science Friday vibe because we're going to be speaking with a science journalist and author, Bethany Brookshire. But for today, we are speaking with Jack Jenkins. Jack is a national reporter for RNS based in Washington, covering the intersection of religion and politics, as well as U.S. Catholics. Before joining RNS in 2018, Jenkins was a senior religion reporter at the Washington-based ThinkProgress. He was also an RNS reporting intern in 2011 and later blogged for RNS. His work has appeared or been referenced in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, MSNBC, and elsewhere. After graduating from Presbyterian College with a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Religion and Philosophy, Jack received his Master of Divinity degree from Harvard University with a focus on Christianity, Islam, and the media. He is based in Washington, D.C. Okay, you are kind of actually like my favorite kind of person to talk to, somebody with a divinity degree. So I really cannot wait to let you just, take over and dazzle us. So I'm going to let you just go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank y'all so much for having me. I should update my bio. I have actually rotated off the sub-beat of Catholicism. It's just all of religion and politics now, which means I still cover Catholicism and every other religion that touches politics. But we need to update that aspect. But yeah, thank y'all so much for bringing me here. As mentioned, I cover religion and politics, and so I actually spend a lot of my time covering conservatives who interact with politics. I actually cover Christian nationalism by name and have done that since at least 2017. But one of the things that I discerned pretty early in my journalism career was that there has been a lot of ink spilled on the what is often called the religious right. More recently, given different shifts in those communities, kind of Christian nationalism, kind of conservative religious interactions with American politics. But there's been relatively little written about any sort of modern iteration of what, for lack of a better term, is called the religious left. We have written, people. There's been a lot of history written about kind of the religious left of, say, the mid 20th century, right? So that's particularly the civil rights movement and the role that faith played in that movement. But there's just kind of a dearth of more broad coverage of what the religious left looks like these days. So the point of my book, American Prophets, which is here over my shoulder, very small, that is that I wanted to kind of look at what the modern religious left, kind of it looks like, acts like, and experiences, and how they actually impact society in a way that may be harder to discern. Now, I'm actually going to use an example that's not in the book because my book came out a few years ago. But on the first full day of President Donald Trump's term, right? You may have seen that he went to the inaugural prayer service. It was an interfaith prayer service that's been held pretty traditionally for a while now that presidents usually go to. And so he went to this prayer service on the first morning. Now, the reason I went there, and I was one of only three reporters who were there, print reporters who were there, who weren't part of the traveling press pool, was because I knew that Bishop Marianne Buddy, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, who preached at that event and was scheduled to preach even before he was elected president, she had been critical of Trump in the past. And I was curious about as to what that would look like given the first full day of Trump's term. And sure enough, she delivered a sermon that turned out to make headlines over the course of a full week. And you saw Speaker Mike Johnson deride her message as a quote unquote radical message. You saw Trump himself refer to her as a so-called bishop. And you saw one group of Republican lawmakers actually introduced a resolution in Congress to condemn her sermon. And I found that fascinating because, and even some of the people, one of the lawmakers actually left the service during her sermon. And her sermon, the parts they were disagreeing with was her expressing, asking the president to have mercy on transgender and LGBTQ youth, as well as immigrants and refugees. And it was interesting to hear Mike Johnson characterize that as a quote unquote radical ideology, and other members of Congress as well. Because anyone who's been paying attention to these religious circles for years knows that this is not unusual, that this is a group of people that have been deeply involved in these sorts of causes, whether that's advocating for refugees or immigrants or LGBTQ people. And it happens to be some stuff that I have talked about in my book. Now, I should note, a little bit. I should talk a little bit about terms here, right? I use the term religious left because it's kind of the easiest catch-all term. I should note up front that many members of people who might otherwise be described the religious left reject the term for a variety of reasons. Some of them don't feel it necessarily adequately represents their politics. Others say it doesn't actually represent their theology. Still others argue that that's too close to a term and an idea of the religious right, who they don't want to mimic that way of impacting power. And so I give all that caveat, but at the end of the day, there is a significant difference between the religious left and the religious right. We often get these pieces that get written every few years where, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and I have dear religion reporter friends at all those places will write pieces that say, "Hey, did you hear about the religious left? Their thing, isn't that wild?" And it's interesting because it is pitted against the religious right as if they were like the same thing. And my argument, and I make this in the book, is that the religious left and the religious right, by default, are different because the left and the right are different. And what I mean by that is that the modern left, at least the one that we operate in today, and over and against the right, operates as a coalition of coalitions. It is significantly more racially diverse, religiously diverse, gender identity and sexuality than you'll find in the right. And as a consequence, there is nothing on the left like the religious right. There is no single body of voters and organizations that operate in relative lockstep on the left in the way there is on the right. Instead, what you find is a lot of organizations in which certain different groups or entities tend to take the lead, or they operate together in tandem. And the best way I try to explain this in the book, kind of introduce the reader, is that the first chapter focuses entirely on the Affordable Care Act. And the reason I did that is because, according to Barack Obama, the only reason they ended up getting the Affordable Care Act across the finish line is because Catholic nuns got involved. And to hear them tell the story, obviously a number of organizations, secular and otherwise, advocated for healthcare reform for quite some time. But when it came down to the very end of whether they were going to get the House to pass this bill, there were a number of Democrats who were moderate, who were also Catholic. At the time, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops had more power politically, arguably, than they have now. And so they had come out against the bill. And then one Catholic nun who ran the Catholic Health Association at the time quietly released in their intra Catholic Health Association publication an endorsement of this bill, which made sense because she was in the room helping craft it for several months, because she was really invested in healthcare. Well, they pushed this out there, and then it turns out a whole other group of nuns signed on, and then a whole nother group of nuns signed on to this legislation, and that is credited with giving these lawmakers cover. And that is why when President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law. He saved one of the pens that he used to sign that for a Catholic nun and gave it to her specifically because he saw that as a crucial part of moving that piece of legislation across the finish line. And so that's just one of the ways that the religious left has made a kind of actualized power. And that's kind of an insidery, policy-wise DC story. The other ways are actually somewhat more obvious, but not necessarily seen as inherently religious stories. So to back up, when uh, in North Carolina back in 2013 and 2014, there was a particularly conservative state legislature, a very Republican legislature that was passing a lot of laws that were that the position of many progressives and many moderates in the state were infringing on a lot of just not only rights but also services for the average North Carolinian. It was then that the Reverend William Barber began an initiative called the Moral Mondays movement. It was this effort where they would hold an event every Monday outside the Capitol, advocating for this particular cause, which for them was actually a pantheon of causes that was all rooted in the idea of, hey, like we don't like what the state legislature is doing. Now, this is one of the strengths of the religious left. They have the capacity, the somewhat unique capacity for protest. That's rooted in the civil rights history. It's also rooted in the fact that they are, religious groups by default are usually fairly organized. So they're able to have churches or synagogues or mosques and what have you that are able to organize out of. So Barber, what he referred to as fusion organizing, which used a pantheon of different religious groups and some secular groups to show up together for these protests. And then, importantly, to get arrested during these demonstrations, slowly built support for their cause over and against the cause of the Republican legislature in that state. And so in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected and there was very few bright spots for Democrats that day, in North Carolina, the Republican governor was unseated. And many analysts have credited the Moral Mondays movement, this faith-led, deeply religious, spiritual movement in partnership with secular allies as well as secular organizations that helped pull that across the finish line. So again, you kind of see a religious group as a convener, a religious leader as a convener of a larger entity, where that wouldn't necessarily look the same on the right, where these groups actually had a very intentional effort to say, okay, this whole section of us are religious. This other whole section of us isn't, and we're gathering together and take inspiration from each other in order to overcome this obstacle that they saw as the state legislature. That has been repeated. During Trump's first administration, it was William Barber who was one of the key elements who held protests on Capitol Hill that again resulted in a myriad of arrests that helped, it is credited with helping persuade particularly then Senator John McCain to refuse the effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. In fact, if you go back and you listen to that moment when he gave the thumbs down to the effort to repeal and replace the ACA, you can hear some gasps in the background. Those gasps are faith-based advocates that had been on the Hill, protesting and getting arrested, what have you, for weeks. And so it kind of, the religious left, as I worked on this book, slowly emerged as this thing that keeps showing up. And more they started working with each other throughout the Trump administration. And that leads me to, for instance, the climate element, where we have two very different aspects of the religious landscape that ended up working relatively in tandem. One of them is, of course, Pope Francis, and with his encyclical Laudato Si. He released that and kind of really unsettled the idea that pushing against climate change was a uniquely liberal position, in the sense that if you consider the Catholic Church a conservative entity, which by many definitions it is, then the fact that the Pope was out there advocating for taking action on climate change said a lot. And it actually ended up getting awkward for many Republican lawmakers who were running for president around the time after that came out, because they kept getting questions about, like, well, what do you advocate against taking action on climate change, but the Pope said this other thing. What do you say to that? And then that's how we started getting answers from Republicans that maybe the Pope should just stick to theology and not policy. then people would come back and say, okay, but you did cite the Pope when it comes to abortion. So when are you going to? And so it became it unsettled arguments that used to be relatively streamlined in American politics when it comes to religion and politics. The other big one that people kind of forget is the Standing Rock protection. When there were those mass protests with indigenous folks, and that even brought in many others. People forget that was an explicitly spiritual religious event. That was the camp that they set up there was referred to as a prayer camp, and it was deeply rooted in many spiritual ideas. And the indigenous demonstrators continue to do that in other protests elsewhere. So, for instance, in Mauna Kea in Hawaii, protesting against a telescope there. There's an environmental element to that as well. The construction could lead to some environmental desecration, but it's also mostly, in many ways, a religious claim by the part of those protesters, or protectors, as the term that they use, because they see the mountain as sacred. As one protector told me, he's like, other people kind of have these theories about whether or not our God exists. I know my God exists. It's the mountain. I can see it. And so that's a whole element of climate and environmental activism these days. And I should note, it inspires other pieces. So there was a bartender in New York who felt inspired to go participate in the Standing Rock protest. And according to hear her tell the story, she was deeply inspired spiritually by that protest. It had a spiritual effect on her. That is how she describes it. She felt pulled like a magnet spiritually to that demonstration. And she was Catholic, but she felt that this was a very spiritual calling for her, and it inspired her to go back to New York and run for Congress. And that's how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a member of Congress. And that's her version of the story. And she's recited it several times since. So again, if we heard that in a conservative context, we would consider that like, oh, that is an evidence of the religious right, and like that's evidence of this, like, this conservative religious influence on politics. But it doesn't get as much press on the left. We kind of skip over their stories, or do not necessarily cover them the same way. And I'll include a slight addendum that isn't in my book, but I think it's helpful for context, which is that one thing that I've found as a religion reporter over the years is that it's actually really not that uncommon to find um, Democrats, for instance, on the Hill using religious language on a regular basis. It's just less common to hear it reported, because to Hill reporters' credit, they know that when conservatives invoke faith, they're speaking to a pretty powerful constituency, both in terms of ballot box power as well as political power. But when Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, gave her speech saying, "Okay, I'm not going to pursue party leadership anymore," a third of that speech was just her talking about faith. It was about her Catholicism, rooting in it, and like you can literally look up the reports of that speech, and they just cut out the third. And part of that is because it maybe wasn't necessarily directly policy focused, but the other part of it is because I think religion reporting can be hard. You're having to parse a lot of different faiths at the same time. Sometimes you like hear somebody reference something and you don't know what that is, and so you know that it'll take like 20 minutes for you to figure out what it is, and then you aren't sure about it, and like it gets awkward. And so there's this temptation to just kind of cut it out. And so, we hear over and over and over again, if you listen, all these religious appeals on the Hill. Heck, the only active minister in the Senate is a Democrat, Raphael Warnock, and that this is not an uncommon finding. In fact, another chapter in my book that I talk about is that Barack Obama's 2008 campaign had arguably the largest intentional faith outreach effort of any recent presidential campaign of either party. And to hear his former faith outreach director say it was a crucial element of his election. Admittingly, there was 1,000 things that were crucial when you're running that election, but they actually made some gains with young evangelicals, for instance, and they credit that to the efforts that they made. And then later, they also credit it because faith outreach both can reach towards moderate and conservative angles, but it also can reach more base voters, whether that's Black Protestants, who make up a huge percentage of the Democratic primary base. It's arguably why Joe Biden was able to become president, in particularly in South Carolina. And then liberal mainliners as well. This is also a group that, if energized, can show up in a way at the ballot box. But all of that, again, also, that's only one way that politics happens, right? So we've talked about, kind of the policy element of it. We've talked about stuff on the Hill. We've talked about kind of protests and activism. All of those can move the needle in terms of what laws impact individuals. There's also sometimes this work that happens that's just, religious individuals trying to change the national conversation. And one example of that in the book is what's called the New Sanctuary Movement. Now, this has a little history. I won't bore you with all of it, but in the 80s, there was the original sanctuary movement. I believe it actually happened in y'all state. There's a church in y'all state, and it's a Presbyterian church that helped kick this off. And there were migrants that were coming from Central and South America, and they were not being welcomed as refugees or migrants or asylum seekers at the time. But a group of churches along the border said, we're going to take them in anyway, and dared the federal government to come do something about it. Now, the federal government did. They actually did infiltrate and indict several members who were participants of this effort. But it's credited with actually helping change how the federal government treated a lot of these asylum seekers in terms of like altering their legal status or granting them any sort of temporary status at all. But what happened many years later, actually underneath the Obama administration, there was a memo that was passed in 2011, or it was written in 2011 within Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that discouraged raids at churches, hospitals, schools, and other quote unquote sensitive locations. So technically they can still raid those places, but it was discouraged from doing so. And attached to that discouragement was, particularly if you're talking about someone who doesn't have a criminal record, we're talking about, somebody who's lived here for a decade, who has a family. And what ended up happening is a lot of these churches, including that one in Arizona, started a new sanctuary movement where people who were at risk of deportation, they would grant them residence in their churches and basically dare the federal government to come and deport them. And it started under the Obama administration and ramped up very quickly under Trump's first term. And that became a whole thing, and many people had their deportation orders dropped after they would wait out sometimes a year or 2 years, what have you. And it was a long, arduous process for a lot of those involved, but people credited it with helping change the conversation. I should note that during the 2020 election, we actually had presidential candidates on the Democratic side. A couple of them actually visited people who were in sanctuary and expressed solidarity with them. I give that context because, as you may or may not be aware, the Trump administration under this second term has rescinded this policy. It has sparked two different lawsuits brought by faith groups. One which was led by the Quakers, as well as the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is the denomination that Jimmy Carter belonged to before he died, as well as a Sikh temple out west. And then there is a second lawsuit that has 27 different faith groups that have signed on to it, including entire denominations, in challenging the Trump administration's decision to rescind this policy. And they have won victories at court so far. The Quaker-led lawsuit in particular has won a victory where I believe they got a TRO. Someone can double check this on this, that disallows any sorts of raids at churches, at the ones who are within the lawsuit. So other religious communities are not necessarily affected by that. But this is a point of real concern because within the first week or so of Trump being inaugurated, we did have an arrest at a church in the Atlanta area. Of an asylum seeker who reportedly was wearing an ankle bracelet. So advocates point out, why you knew where he was. Did you have to arrest him at a church? And so this has become a part of our national discourse. So I bring that up because my book came out right at the tail end of the first Trump administration, but many of the figures, many of the people that I write about in here have continued to play a pretty prominent role. And quite frankly, I expect will play an even more prominent role in the coming weeks, because the tail end of my talk, while I have time left, is that, I've talked to you about, there's also a whole chapter on racial justice. People don't know this, but you may know that when they carried the torches in Charlottesville, when there was the white nationalist, white supremacist torch rally there, across the street from that was a group, a large gathering of religious people who had come in to pray against and protest that group. And there was a lot of tensions there the next day. Some of the first responders, when the horrific killing with the car happened the next day, some of the first people down there to assist were some of the clergy that had come down that day. And on January 6th, there was one in-person counter protest in Washington, D.C. And that was there's a reason there weren't that many counter protests, but the a lot of progressive groups had discouraged them, and the mayor had discouraged them. But a group of clergy were gathered around a Black Lives Matter sign on January 6th in Washington, D.C. because the Black Lives Matter signs had been torn off of churches in D.C. in the weeks before by members of the Proud Boys. And so on January 6th, that is the one counter protest in the city that day was by religious leaders, which is a recurring theme that I'm seeing play out as Trump has been reelected as well. The long story short here is that the religious left, for lack of a better term, is a very organized and passionate entity. And one of the stories that we heard going into Trump's second term was that a lot of progressive and liberal activists were quote unquote tired. There was a lot of headlines about how there was some level of exhaustion and advocacy exhaustion. And but after Bishop Marianne Budde delivered her sermon, I have heard from secular groups that just seeing that sort of resistance to Trump was inspiring to them. And that since then, with the 5 different lawsuits filed by faith groups against this administration so far, that everyone from the U and one of those lawsuits, by the way, was filed by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So to bring this full circle, from folks that were mad at the Obama administration about the ACA to now currently suing the Trump administration um, that over refugee resettlement, that these groups have kind of really come back together in the way they did in the first Trump administration to protest him, and that doesn't surprise me because I will note, for instance, if you saw Trump's recent joint address to Congress. Senator Al Green was the person who stood up and protested and was then escorted out. I've seen Al Green at faith-based protests for years, including William Barber demonstrations. And so that was not necessarily surprising to me that he might be the person to do such a thing. But again, oftentimes the protests that I see him at, no one else is there because the religious left often holds large demonstrations without other people in attendance because they're kind of doing it on their own. When a Republican administration comes into power, and particularly when Trump has come into power, that changes. And we've seen the religious left kind of take on a leadership role with a number of different initiatives where they're the ones kind of out front, not in any way alone, not the only people doing this, but in many ways, because they are compelled by their faith and because they are organized, they are quick to move in these spaces. Now, I will say a lot of the things I covered in my book, I'm curious how they're going to look this go round. This administration is taking a much harder line on immigration, for instance, and really, is seeking to up their deportation levels. I'm not sure if we're going to see the same level of support for the new sanctuary movement, for instance, as we saw the first term, frankly, because people are more concerned about the legal implications of doing so. It is unclear to me how advocates for racial justice will muster that same level of support in this first Trump administration. The second Trump administration. I will say there is also, since the first Trump administration, a lot more organizing around opposition to forms of Christian nationalism among progressive and liberal religious groups, including Christian groups. I'm curious to see how that manifests this go round, given that we have prominent members of this administration, for instance, Russell Vogt, who itself identify as Christian nationalists. I'm curious to see how liberal and progressive faith communities push back against that when they are not in power. But I think that if you're looking at activism, I think this is a key group to pay attention to, because in some ways, it doesn't surprise me at all, for instance, that there is a lot of conversation right now around the initiated deportation of the Columbia student. That there has been both, this is where it gets complicated, where there has been both support for that among some Jewish leaders and also protests against it led by Jewish organizations. There was just a protest yesterday that filled up the lobby of Trump Tower, for instance, led by Jewish Voice for Peace in opposition to that deportation. I expect to see more of that. So my book does, I think, would give you a good grounding to kind of see where these groups are, where they come from, who some of the major leaders are. But I will say the fascinating thing about the religious left is that because it's a coalition of coalitions, because it's this incredibly diverse group in a way that's very distinct from the religious right, myself as a reporter am constantly learning the new names, new organizations, new entities. Sometimes groups will only exist for a year or two, and then they will be subsumed into something else. And sometimes issues that have had a following for a long time. So, for instance, one of some of the first advocates for abortion rights early on were actually clergy. There's a whole history there, and now you've seen quite a bit of religious support for abortion rights as this has been returned to the states, and I expect that to continue as well. But you know, if you, I had thought that I should include a chapter on abortion rights in my first book, and I was like, I don't know if there's enough. And now I'm like, I could have filled an entire book just of that. So I've been speaking for about half an hour. I'm happy to speak for another half an hour, but I didn't know if there was any questions at this point. So.
Well, we could probably definitely listen to you speak, but there is one question coming from Philip, and he asks, do the religious left and religious right make any attempts to talk with each other to discuss issues of importance on which they may either agree or disagree?
So this is a fascinating question. The short answer is mostly no. And there's a problem where let's talk about just one religious group. Let's just talk about Christians. There is a not insubstantial subset among conservative Christians who do not consider liberal or progressive Christians. Like they do not deign them to be of the same faith. And there is some who are within the liberal and progressive space who also do not believe that the Christians on the other side are actually Christians. So there's a theological wall that they can sometimes butt up against. There have been moments of overlap. For instance, with criminal justice reform, we've seen some levels of support. I will note with immigrant rights in particular, that is a piece where there are exceptions to this, but it is generally true that among religious communities there is support for immigrants and support for immigrant rights. For instance, in um, my experience as a religion reporter, there has never been a policy for which I have seen more uniform religious opposition than the family separation policy during Trump's first term. I mean, it was like virtually uniform from like every conservative religious denomination I could think of, all the liberal and moderate ones. It was just like overwhelming condemnation of that policy. And so there are moments, and it has been discussed for quite some time, this potential for a brokering, for instance, of immigration reform that would be led by an alliance of conservative and religious leaders who agree generally on this point. And again, it's not lost on me that, during Joe Biden's administration, one of the first things that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops did was discuss how they were upset about his abortion stance. There was basically a year-long debate that danced around this idea of whether or not Joe Biden should be given communion because of his abortion stance. A few bishops actually said they weren't going to give him, or particularly Nancy Pelosi, communion because of that, right? And this was like this battle between the second Catholic president and the Catholic bishops. It has been not even 2 months into Trump's term, and the USCCB is already suing him, right? And on immigration, as the bishop who chairs the USCCB's immigration committee put it, they hope and expect that the administration might do something about religious liberty, which they might agree with. But as he put it, if these are our friends, I would hate to see our enemies. And so that is a point where there have been times when the bishops' conference has been considered part of the religious right, part of this position that, and it's certainly true that when it comes to abortion rights in particular, the USCCB has been no friend to the left and no friend to liberal and progressive religious communities that have long backed abortion rights. But they have been willing to work with a lot of those partners when it comes to immigration reform and immigrant rights in particular. There's also some work that happens around climate issues involving the USCCB. They have traditionally, with a few very prominent exceptions, the bishops. I'm not talking about Pope Francis, who's been very vocal about this, but the bishops here in the United States, that sometimes have worked with other groups on on this issue. They even met with the White House during the Biden administration about climate efforts. But to circle back to my original point, one of the really fascinating things about the work that I do is that I often am asking these groups about each other. And it's anecdotal, but in my experience, the religious left groups tend to be far more aware of both the arguments and the theological positions of those on the other side of the aisle than the opposite. And so it's interesting to me that when I will ask, for instance, a progressive religious leader about a position or a policy from a conservative religious leader, they will know who the person is. They will have a salient position on that. When I will ask these conservative leaders about, what do you say to progressive Christian leaders who argue otherwise? They're either unfamiliar with the concept or dismiss it out of hand. And the efforts I've seen to try to get these groups to have conversations with each other have been pretty muted. There was a period when Charlie Kirk, when he was at, those who do not know, he founded the Turning Point USA, which has been very influential in y'all state and elsewhere. When he worked at what's then called the Falkirk Center at Liberty University, he challenged a few progressive leaning faith leaders to a debate, but he wanted to set all the terms of the debate, and it didn't actually happen. But that was one of the only times that I've seen there's like an intentional effort to try to get these groups to talk to each other. There was a period early on in the Trump administration where a bunch of more liberal-leaning evangelical Christians were actually protesting Liberty University and trying to have a conversation with then Liberty University President Jerry Falwell Jr., who was a close ally of Trump's for a long time before he had his own downfall in public. And there was efforts to try to broker conversations there. They were largely unsuccessful. And quite frankly, for me, the Bishop Buddy's sermon was fascinating, in part precisely because it was these two groups of people. Because what many folks may not know is that in addition to President Trump and Vice President Vance sitting in the front row and Speaker Johnson right there next to them and several lawmakers, there were also several evangelical leaders that were advisors to Trump during his first administration, as well as some soon-to-be cabinet members like Pete Hegseth. And it was fascinating to see them have to hear a sermon from a liberal-leaning progressive faith leader, which I haven't seen them had to do before. And the reaction was not positive for them, but that I think kind of speaks to the fact that it's actually relatively rare for the activists, the most vocal pieces of these entities, to have direct conversations with each other. And I am often eagerly fascinated whenever they do. So if you hear them talking to each other, please let me know. But yeah.
We'll be sure to flood your inbox for sure. Here's a question from Jude. How does this alignment of political positions affect our insistence on separation of church and state?
So the one thing that is generally true within progressive faith groups, so in the religious left broadly, is actually a deep support for the separation of church and state. And they advocate it often from a position of, I don't want to be telling the government what to do, and I don't want the government telling me what to do as a person of faith. And part of that is built on, if you're just looking at kind of the religious left consensus and coalition that got formed basically over the course of the 20th century. On the Christian side of things, there was an ecumenical movement where it was, people kind of forget whenever you kind of hear appeals to this past when America was Christian, that assumes that all Christians liked each other and hung out with each other and didn't fight with each other constantly, which they did. They fought all the time, and it was like they hanged what was it? The Puritans hanged Quakers in Boston, right? Because they didn't recant their beliefs in alignment with Puritanism. So the ecumenical movement of the 20th century, which is mostly liberal and mainline denominations deciding that they should hang out with each other, was a big important thing, because what it said is that it doesn't, obviously there's the separation of church and state that has been, this legacy throughout American history, but the kind of modern understanding of it in the 20th century that a lot of these groups kind of, in terms of how they rhetorically interacted with it, was predicated on the idea that everybody benefits if nobody's in charge, right? And in terms of one singular religious group, and that is, and it also is practically ends up being valuable for a lot of these religious left groups because the coalitions that they form almost always won't be strong enough on the left if they are only one faith group. And so they need to have other faith groups with them, and they need other secular groups with them as well, which is why you will often hear the same line from politicians and from activists. They'll be up in the podium, they'll be in front of the microphone and be like, we want, they'll be speaking to a religious audience, and they will say, we just want to make sure that we advocate for this. We as people of faith and of no faith, and they always include that addendum because it's, an interesting dynamic within, if you're a Democratic politician these days, is that because of the way the demographics work out, you have to convince to vote for you if you're just talking about a Democratic primary, for instance, some of the least and some of the most religious voters at the same time. And that is a difficult, that's not always an easy square to circle unless you kind of are able to appeal to the idea that you can be fully and abundantly religious, but not in a way that lords an idea over someone else. So the religious left, generally speaking, is usually pretty cautious about that. I've seen it even take further preeminence in a lot of these conversations with the rise of Christian nationalism. It's actually been interesting to watch Christian groups in particular get even more reticent, or even more strident and delineating between when they're talking about, I'm talking about this from my position of faith. This is why I support this. This is not why you necessarily have to support this. I don't think you should be ascribed to my faith. There's like a lot of that where there's a difference between the separation of church and state and the elimination of faith from politics, right? Like one of those is like a legal code. The other one is like sociologically speaking, people of faith will be a part of the political project no matter what. And so, but it has been really interesting to see, the Christians Against Christian Nationalism group that got founded in 2018. It was underneath the the person who leads it now is underneath the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. The reason that those two things go together is that from their perspective, they think religious liberty is guaranteed from a liberal and progressive perspective, if and only if the separation of church and state is also protected, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, that definitely provides perspective. And yeah, we were lucky enough a couple of years ago to partner with Amanda Tyler with Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I think when she was maybe promoting her book or something. It's kind of a long question, but it's a really good one. This one comes from Erica. I perceive the religious right as people who are using Christianity as a source of their own cultural identity while ignoring the scripture and teachings of the religion itself. And I perceive the religious left as people who are adherents of Christian scripture. However, it could be that the people on the left have built up their own cultural identity and they're not really looking at scripture either. How much of the religious left is based on a devotion to scripture, and how much of it is just another use of Christianity as a cultural rallying point for what has become liberal politics? What a great question.
It's a fantastic question. And it's the worst question because there's no easy answer, right? And I mean that with deep respect. Basically, one, I want to be very clear. The conservatives, I'm going to get a little nerdy here, so go with me. And again, you can find versions of this in multiple different religious traditions. The one that has had one of the biggest outsized impacts on American politics is the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 20th century. So I won't go down the full road here, but Christians got mad at each other because more liberal, or referred to as modernist Christians, were kind of incorporating elements of archaeology and history and science into their theology and kind of marrying them in a way that some of the more conservative members of that tradition felt was not in keeping with scripture's preeminence, right? That if you're adding the science, then you're not taking scripture at its word. At the same time, there was a movement called the social gospel movement, which is actually tied to the original progressive movement in the United States, that thought that, hey, maybe there's a thing called collective or societal sin, And that's bad. And it was a response to, like, say, child labor during the Industrial Revolution, where they thought we should advocate against this social gospel, kind of was strident in supporting the poor and the dispossessed. Martin Luther King later identified himself as, like, I'm a social gospeler. It became a consistent thing throughout history. These groups split, and the split led to what were called, they were the conservative sort of thing called the fundamentals, and that's where we get fundamentalist, and then they rebranded as evangelicals. And one of the arguments at the time from the fundamentalists was that the liberals were capitulating to culture, and that they were just, like, being sucked into, insofar as secular culture existed at the time, that's where they were being dragged into, these modernist Christians. The modernist Christians, meanwhile, thought that the fundamentalists were, not adequately engaging with Christ, because they were getting bogged down in these details and missing God's grandeur. I'm oversimplifying this debate, and my professors will be mad at me for saying this, but I bring that up because the critique for the last century or so has been rooted in what you were just talking about, with both groups accusing the other of not adequately reading scripture, right? So today I hear quite a bit in the religious left that, for instance, Christian nationalists are heretics. I've heard that quite a few times, and I've asked people, self-described Christian nationalists, how they feel about being called heretics or apostates. And that's kind of like a part of religious history, and a part of Christian history is, like, you're a heretic. Welcome to a Christian history of people calling each other heretics. But I will say, a lot of this can come down to interpretation. And as a religion reporter, I take people at their word in terms of that they believe their faith, and then I ask them questions about it that are, if, like, well, if you do believe that, then this follow-up question is really important, right? And I will say, look, politics is politics, power is power, and people like power and want it. And so, can religion and has religion been used as something to attain power? Yeah, I think that's been true throughout history. Can it also be used? And this is an interesting part of my job, is that I also will see people who are doing what they do who get no benefit from it whatsoever, but are driven by their faith to help people. For instance, one of my first um, features I ever wrote as a journalist was I went down to a respite center along the U.S.-Mexico border, and it was taking in migrants at what the time was called the child migrant crisis, but it was the mothers and their children who were just been released from Customs and Border Protection, and they were taking in at this Catholic church these migrants as they were released from Border Patrol, and these women had often walked 1,500 miles through horrific conditions to come here. At the time, I will tell you, Ted Cruz, Glenn Beck, and two other Republican lawmakers were at that respite center celebrating the work that they do, which is an interesting reversal from where the GOP sits on this same thing now. But as those immigrant mothers and their children walked in, all of the volunteers turned around and, like, applauded for them and said "bienvenidos" and welcome, and, like, people, like, broke down in tears. And it was one of those things where it's like, I don't think, it would. I am skeptical of the idea that a lot of those volunteers are there because it's just part of an identity and not because of their faith. And quite frankly, some of the volunteers I talked about had really complicated feelings about immigration, but were like, my faith says I have to be a part of this, right? Like, and I will see that in parts of the right as well. However, I think that the greater battle that tends to play out in public is, and what I do think is an interesting element of covering the religious left compared to the religious right, is until recently, um, in general, the religious right was more in lockstep with the Republican Party, or perhaps the other way around, than the religious left was. I mean, the religious left is some of the first to protest against the left. They're some of the first to, there was a very large demonstration that actually, I think, one of, if not the largest mass peaceful arrest demonstration on Capitol Hill was actually held by William Barber. There was like 3 reporters there. It was like a weird thing that nobody covered. But he was against Joe Manchin and his refusal to get rid of the filibuster. I've seen liberal demonstrators out there guided by their faith far more often than I've seen conservative protesters doing the same. Now, I will say it's gotten a little interesting around abortion politics. You've now seen there's a division within the Republican Party where there are some faith-based advocates who think the party isn't doing enough on IVF, or like that any support for IVF is abhorrent. So there actually are some fractures that there've always been fractures, but big ones that are opening up on the right as well. But I'm just pointing that out to say the religious left is often, generally speaking, operating off of what they refer to as the prophetic tradition. That is one that's used by many member leaders there. And what they mean by that is that they often are willing to stand alone, and they get less in the way of power by virtue of doing it. And maybe they want power, but I will say, like, one thing that stuck out to me about the Biden administration is Biden had Barber preach at his inaugural prayer service, right? Where Buddy was before, that's where Biden was, that's where Barber was. And, if that was supposed to guarantee some sort of entree with the Biden administration, I'm not sure he got that. It certainly wasn't the level of access that evangelicals have enjoyed in Trump's first administration and potentially his second administration. Barber, for instance, very much wanted to hold a summit on poverty at the White House. To my knowledge, that never happened. So the left tends to work differently in terms of how it interacts with all these different pieces. And that might speak to how much power the religious left has versus how much the religious right has. Although it was a little interesting, I know I'm going on a tangent here, but that during the 2020 primary, several different organizations attempted to host presidential forums where they would come. And outside of the networks, right, when they hold presidential forums or debates, the largest number of candidates who appeared at one presidential forum was actually a Poor People's Campaign event that Barber held in DC. And it had 9 different candidates, and there were supposed to be 10, but he missed his flight. And Biden was there. So there was this moment where they really wanted to show some association with these groups and these activists. But it doesn't seem to be the same equation in terms of the religious left's influence on on democratic politics and access, as opposed to on the right, where I think there's deep influence by conservative religious leaders there who also enjoy a high degree of access. So that's just my 10,000-foot opinion, but I think it's a very good question.
Really good. Yeah. Yeah, this one comes from Ian. He's our board chair. And he says, oops, hold on, let me get back to it. Thinking about messaging, do you think church and state is the best delineation as opposed to separation of religion and government, or separation of faith and government? Or I guess I'm acknowledging that church isn't the entirety of the religious freedoms necessary, and state doesn't really mean the same thing to people and sort of obfuscates what it really means. Do you have any thoughts about that observation?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I can give you any tips on messaging, but I can tell you that, you know, I, as everyone I'm sure here knows, the church and state references referencing specific language that ends up becoming relevant in a legal context. I'll tell you, it's been interesting when I'm covering these events to kind of hear, that piece I did earlier where I said there's separation church and state and there's like faith and politics and how people often delineate those two. But I think it's a fair point where church, particularly at this point in American history, whereas it technically still does have a legal definition, I believe, in the tax code. There's a many number of religious institutions that would never call their house of worship or their place of worship a church. And I do think there's something interesting about the idea of like state doesn't quite mean the same thing as it would have, what it meant to the common reader back when Thomas Jefferson was writing a letter to the Danbury Baptists, for instance. So I don't have a good answer to that one. I just think it's a really good question, and I would defer you to the, what is it, Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They might have some strong opinions on this one way or another. But yeah, I think this is a thing that I deal with a lot in my work, like the power of language and the difficulty of conveying precisely what you want the reader to know, even both me as a writer and then like listening to these advocates try very hard to try to get their message across. And I hear them talk a lot about how properly do you message a religious argument in a space that may not be able to receive it in the same way. So I deeply sympathize with the struggle, but I'm not sure I have any answers. So.
I do find myself saying separation of religion and government just because I feel like it might be, I don't know, just easier to, I mean, we're having a whole discussion right now because like the word secular isn't necessarily something that people are like, I know exactly what that means.
Huh.
You know what I mean? And
Huh.
so, we're having discussions about the possibilities of rebranding
Oh,
to
wow.
really be explicit with who we are. It's just we used to our tagline used to be secular AZ, Arizona's voice for secular government. So it's like, okay, well, I already didn't understand what secular AZ was, and now you're telling me secular. And so we changed it to your voice for separation of church and state. And I'm not joking. Like I would go, I have this banner that I put up when we do tabling events, and in the beginning, people would just kind of wander by and they didn't really know who we were. And as soon as we
Huh.
put that new tagline in, people were like, where do I sign up? So
Really?
for
Huh.
real, yeah, it's a whole thing. And again, we keep having these conversations. Um, First of all, I want to say a few things. I appreciate the talk about donations in the chat. So thank you very much to everybody who's currently donating, because this kind of Friday programming, whether we're raging or actually having a good time. I mean, I think you actually give me a little bit of hope today, Jack, because we don't talk about the religious left in the same way. And our theme this year for Secular AZ has been building bridges and working explicitly with, faith-based organizations. In fact, there was an incident that happened here, and I don't know if it necessarily made national news, but we also have, I think, four ordained ministers in our state legislature.
Huh.
Two of them are Republicans who have like kind of, Bible-based in their living room kind of situations where they preach. And then the other two, one is an AME minister, and the other one is a Presbyterian minister. And
Huh.
they introduced us at our day at the Capitol just this past week. And interestingly enough, the Freedom Caucus, while we were being introduced, they all left the floor. They left the
Huh.
floor to show their disdain for this secular group. Meanwhile, we're being introduced by two ordained ministers. It's
Huh.
wild. Yeah. And neither of them like the fact that they have invocations at the beginning. So back to my story. One of those ordained ministers, in the members lobby, they keep these Bibles there, and she's never really liked that. She even leaves during the invocations. She doesn't participate in the invocations. She goes out and then she comes back in because she believes firmly in the separation of church and state.
Hmm.
So she took these Bibles and she hid them. She hid some under some cushions in a
Oh,
refrigerator.
wow.
It was scandalous. Like there was an ethics committee hearing, and
Oh, wow.
you know who showed up to support her and defend her? Progressive religious leaders.
Huh.
Yeah,
Huh.
it was, and
Yeah.
it ended up dying. The optics weren't great. Here's a woman who's a mother and a minister, and all she did was, and they were just like, oh, desecration of, it was an interesting time. So I'm sorry to take up all that time, because what we really want to hear from you, Jack, and especially in studying this kind of religious everything, what gives you hope these days?
Oh, oh, wow. I mean, I think uh I will say if you um always feel free to have words of affirmation for your local journalists. We're trying. This is without question the busiest time of my entire career, and I've been doing this a minute. There's just no shortage of stuff to cover. And I think that, from where I sit, I am encouraged by how passionate my colleagues are to continue to do the work that we do, and how much some of them are willing to risk to do that. And there's there have been lots of criticisms within our profession about how to show solidarity with your fellow journalists, and how best to do that. But I can tell you, behind closed doors, where there's really not that many of us left, frankly. There's, I don't know how much y'all follow journalism news, but like a lot of outlets have folded in the last few years. There's been lots of layoffs. So a lot of my friends at big publications don't have jobs anymore. But so to see a lot of these different publications kind of crop up, these like 4 or 5 reporter publications that we're seeing in local places across the country that are dedicated to doing the reporting at this time. Some of the bigger scoops that have happened around this incoming Trump administration have come out of those smaller publications, and it's just inspiring to see folks continue to pursue a profession that, for most of us, isn't the most high-paying profession in the world, but that a lot of folks feel is a crucial component of a thriving and active democracy. And that predated Trump's election in the sense that I've seen some of these folks try to do that. But it's been really inspiring to see the quality and the depth of journalism from my colleagues across the board. We're all very tired, so please, and I have a 1.5-year-old, so to add all pieces of that, so it's been fun. But
Ooh.
if you, but that I will say, just to stay in my lane, as it were, is a thing that definitely continues to give me hope.
No, I appreciate that. And absolutely, as media is consolidated, I'm seeing a lot of my favorite journalists leave their, the spaces that they've been in for a long time and maybe start up a Substack or just do some more. And I make a point of subscribing, and I went
Mhm.
ahead and put your website in there. And so that means I
Oh,
hope
thank you.
that, and the praise in the chat, just so you know, it's wildly positive. So if all of you want to continue to support the work that Jack Jenkins does, I put that website in there. And just thank you so much for joining us today and get some rest with a 1.5-year-old. My goodness.
I'll see what I can do.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And again, thanks, Jack. I appreciate you. Take care,
Thank
everybody.
y'all.
All right. Bye-bye.